Okay, everybody, let us get started. So, my name is Scott Spector. I am here to talk to you today about how to make accessibility more approachable. Really making sure that your clients understand, or whoever you're working with, make them understand what accessibility is, so you are talking with them and not to them. And with that, I'm going to stop my video so you all can see the presentation and I don't mess up the recording. And let us get into it. So again, I'm Scott Spector. I'm the Director of Accessibility and Quality at Toyota Creative here in Washington, D.C. This being obviously the DrupalCon European Conference, I just wanted to show you guys on the map real quick where I live over there in D.C. As one of my favorite things about these conferences is being able to talk to people from all different walks of life. So I live in Washington, D.C. I'm really big into Formula One, love spinach and tomato omelets. And most importantly, I want to obviously start these by saying, I am not a lawyer, nor am I a doctor. Everything I'm about to talk to you today about is based solely on my nearly a decade of accessibility work in the space, but of course, take it as such and not anything legal or medically binding. And before I jump into it, I do believe a little bit of credibility goes a long way. So I just want to really quickly at the offset say, kind of tell you about what I've done in the past and what our agency does. Because I want to root this conversation in the idea that accessibility should apply to everything you do. Obviously, our bread and butter is Drupal and everything around Drupal, but obviously we do a lot more. That's brand, strategy, development, marketing, and UX design. Everything from web and app development to AR, VR, virtual events, marketing. You name it, we've typically done it. And all of these things, we talk about accessibility in the process. And really quickly, first and foremost, some ground rules. I will try and keep this to an open format as we were just chatting about. This is a shorter session, but I do want to try, I was just saying it is more important for me to answer your questions and to make this presentation matter to you than for me just to finish my deck for the sake of finishing it. So I will be trying to toggle in between hop in and my deck as much as I can. But if I don't get to any of your questions, please stick around the chat and I will just make sure I answer those as soon as I jump as soon as my session concludes here. Please make sure that all questions begin with a compliment about me, of course, loosely enforced, but would be great. And for the duration of the session, this is the safest place on earth. We are all here to learn. I can't stress this part enough. I am not your client. I'm not your boss. Nobody here is judging you, especially just the way the climate of the world today. People find themselves walking on eggshells around the subject. I want to make sure that's not the case here. In order to learn, you want to kind of open yourself up and potentially be a little vulnerable. So please do so with me. All right, let's jump into it. So before we get any further, I want to talk literally about the science of the subject, and most importantly about the spectrum of the subject. As most of you are aware, if you're at all familiar with accessibility, we generally lump the practice area into these four categories about talking about disabilities. Not to say these are the only ones. Obviously, there's divergence is more and more coming to the forefront of the science. But we talk about cognitive, auditory, physical, and visual disabilities. And of course, everything being on a spectrum, I might try to do a very rough graphic of this at the bottom. You have your mild, moderate, and more severe types of these disabilities. For example, cognitive disabilities, a very severe one would be something like dementia, Alzheimer's, or even PTSD. Now, the more moderate to mild side of the spectrum, you have disabilities like ADD and ADHD. So it's always important to root every conversation accessibility in that there's no one size fits all. You are doing everyone, frankly, in the world a disservice by assuming that these four things are just four distinct categories that have four distinct solutions. That is not quite the case. I've talked before about how the spectrum I don't even see the spectrum as a line anymore. I kind of see it as like a circular color wheel, if you will, where each of these four quadrants kind of, once you map them, they give you a really good picture of it. So it's very complex and is not just to be seen on a linear spectrum as I'm kind of showing down here, but it is typically the easiest way to kind of talk to the subject and, again, make it a bit more approachable for people that aren't quite familiar with it. And first and foremost, when we talk about making the subject approachable, there's really easy ways to kind of get your foot in the door, really garner that interest from the very beginning. And generally the way I like to talk about it, whether it's with external client stakeholders or with your internal teams, because as you know, sometimes at larger groups or agencies or, when you're one part of a larger effort, it's sometimes a little tough to make accessibility as interesting or as, make it seem as important as a part of that conversation. So I want to just 6 quick ways I generally find, my 6 core principles are, lean into the idea that this is universal design in the making. For lack of a better way to say it, emphasize the idea that you are kind of on the right side of history here, right? You are designing something for a very specific purpose today that could be a standard tomorrow. And I'm actually going to go into an example on that in a quick second. But in the meantime, also, of course, inclusivity and accessibility. Empathy is going to be a key component of this conversation today. So make sure that you are emphasizing an empathetic approach rather than just checking a checkbox. That is, the entire kind of point of this talk today. Brand leadership. I usually emphasize the idea that you need to be the first mover in the space. If you're not the first mover, you kind of have to jump into that realm anyways. Typical prisoner's dilemma. If you don't do it and the other people don't do it, you typically might be okay. But if you do it, then the entire industry has to follow suit. So it's the best way to kind of lean into that, make your products and your brand presence reflective of that as well. Measurable audience expansion. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. Future proofing, making sure you get the right foundations in place now gets you set up for success later. This is an industry that's not going anywhere. So developing something or building something with the compliance in mind sets you up for success later on. Another thing we're going to talk about in a second, we taught, this is obviously Drupal conference, but don't forget that there's other digital aspects around your website. So don't forget your web and your digital, your print media, even everything from your business cards to your PowerPoint decks, mobile apps, and more. And if you really want a really big and powerful slide, I certainly encourage you to screenshot this and send it and save it for your own, as sharing is caring. And these numbers are, of course, rooted in the US. I want to say that since I know we have a large international audience today, but 1 out of every 4 people in the United States, this roughly is 26% or 61.2 million people, have identify with at least one or more disability. And adults, older adults that we classify as 65 and up, have at least one or more of those disabilities. And all these things lead into an idea that there's a $490 billion disposable income market share for users with disabilities. And that is larger than the next 2 demographics beneath it, largest ethnic demographics beneath it, pardon me. So there's a massive business case here. When you talk about making accessibility approachable, it is real. I can give you 1,000 ways to, lean into the empathy side of things, make sure that people care about it. But at the end of the day, if you really need a good way to convince your stakeholders or your clients of this, talk about the business side. This is very obvious. If you are not making an accessible digital presence, you are not tapping into this $490 billion market. And I guarantee you, if you went to your boss with any other subject saying there's $490 billion out there for the taking, it is an easy sell. I can say from experience from many clients that this is always a powerful slide. And again, I think one of the most important things about the subject is making it relatable. This idea of universal design that I spoke about just a second ago. And frankly, I know it's kind of a little faux pas in the accessibility space, if you will, but when speaking about accessibility, I love talking in the form of metaphors, talking about things, the digital space and marrying it to the physical realm a little bit. So this is a silly little example, but it's one of my favorites. One of the first I ever heard, and it stuck with me forever. And that's the idea of the doorknob versus the door handle when we talk about universal design. The doorknob in America was actually outlawed in the early 1990s by the Americans with Disability Act. I'll give you a quick example as to why. Now imagine you're walking to your front door with arms full of groceries, and your front door has a doorknob in front of on it. You're trying to get in, you're trying to move your elbow and your arm, your bicep around, try to squeeze it and open up the door. Dang near impossible. You end up probably dropping a crate of eggs, and you get really upset. Same scenario. Now you're walking to your front door, and there's a door handle in front of you. The image on the right hand side here. It is infinitely easier to get in that door. You either just jimmy it with your knee, you kind of kick it open, use your elbow, and within 5 seconds you are in that door. No eggs lost. Everyone's happy. Now I love this example because again, this is an example of accessible design. Again, that was put into practice because of the Americans with Disability Act. This universal design is just better design. There's no exceptions to the rule. I never met one person that prefers the doorknob, and this is that future proofing. This is universal design. This is getting on the right side of history, and this is making it future proof. This is a fantastic physical personification of why accessibility on the web is just better overall. And now I'm going to switch to Hotbit for just 1 second, make sure there's no questions. Fantastic. Moving right along, again, please don't be afraid to ask questions. I will try and stop as much as I can in this short presentation and answer as many as I can. Now let's talk about project management for a second, as obviously that is a big focus on how to make things approachable. That's generally where most of the client or stakeholder conversations happen. So I like to kind of focus on that for when I talk about making things approachable from an external lens. And as I just kind of talked a lot about the internal lens. So first and foremost, talk about it a lot. I emphasize a lot early and often. It is one of the first things I ever talk about when I meet any client. At our client kickoffs, we talk about it at every single meeting afterwards when we're talking about requirements. It is always something we keep in mind. Even on our agendas, I make sure it just has a evergreen spot there. So even if we're talking about something totally unrelated, we at least have just a quick trigger to say, oh, make sure that this is logical reading order, plain language, who are we going to get to do the alt text, whatever else in between. Dig into your realities and not your ambitions. Most of the times, your clients will be blinded by some reaching goal that their board or their user base is pushing them to do. Like I gave a talk recently about AAA compliance, about how that's not necessarily what clients are actually usually asking for. So dig into realities, figure out what your user base would actually be most affected by in a positive way, and build in that direction. Don't just pick a compliance goal and jump into it. Again, that kind of blind, project direction is where you're going to lose your clients, your internal team. Unless you give a really good reason as to why, it's usually best to inform your build with data with accessibility. That's no different than any other part of the project, but it's especially important here. Know when to let your design team run wild. Of course, this goes into a number 5 there as well. But make sure that you are giving your design team ample kind of room to run. Accessibility is obviously extremely important, but you also want to create something attractive. So make sure you find that middle ground. Define requirements in your tool set. Do not just create requirements at one time. I know that goes against traditional software development kind of principles, but keep those fluid as you go throughout the project. Most importantly, make sure you and your clients, your internal team, are all using the same tool set to audit that accessibility. And don't forget the rest of your audiences. I know this is a bit controversial to say as I'm talking about focusing on accessibility, but always remember that there's accessibility and users with disabilities are only a part of your audience. And if I'm being honest, usually only a very small part of your audience. It is, of course, extremely important to not forget about the users with disabilities, but an easy way to lose the room when you're talking about how to make accessibility more approachable and how to get people more invested in it is to only talk about people with disabilities. So make sure that it is just part of the conversation and not the entire conversation. And one really big part, and this is kind of my bonus here, is that reporting and consulting. From a reporting standpoint, what you see here on the left is what is called a VPAT. VPAT stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, and the output of that template is an accessibility conformance report. Now, I cannot stress enough that if there's one thing you take away from today, it's that documentation is key. You can see here on the left in the VPAT that it's tough to read. Even just looking at it, I get a little bored. It is necessary, and in some cases, it's exactly what the client wants. But for the most part, what we love doing is kind of putting our own brand spin on it. On the right-hand side here, you see a more personalized audit we did for Bruce Wayne's Foundation, Capes for Kids, where he donates his leftover Batman capes to kids in need throughout the city of Gotham. Of course, this is a completely made-up company that I made up just for this example, but I hope it gets the point across. We have a much more approachable grading scale here. We talk a little bit about why we're here and how accessibility is going to kind of push things through. You kind of see the mention of a 40,000-foot view there at the bottom. Again, making it more plain language, making it more approachable. Very rarely is a client going to understand what captions pre-recorded means. But if you explain to them why it matters and what exactly it means in a more personable sense, you're going to get a lot more attention in that room. And this one's, again, a little bit controversial, but I love talking about it because I think it's extremely important. I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation about the importance of creating a safe space. I say this at the beginning. I say that line at the beginning of every single client presentation, whether we're just talking about something simple or we're having a very purposeful, accessibility workshop. So train up your clients on what you're able to do, on how to conquer their own accessibility hurdles themselves. The more they understand about it, the better off you're going to be. You're going to have a mutually beneficial relationship where they're able to contribute to the conversation rather than you just kind of talk to them And again, this idea of, they just want check boxes checked, right? More often than not, your clients are just going to say, someone came to us and said, we need an accessible presence. One of our competitors got sued. We want to make sure that we don't have that. Just go make our stuff accessible. I take a pause. I say, I'd love to teach you more about it. So I have just accessibility content workshops that go a long way. And another thing I want to say, and this is the semi-controversial part, is to have fun with it. You see in this image here on the right is actually an accessibility workshop we did for one of our clients, the U.S. Figure Skating Organization, the governing body for our Olympic team. And what we have here is just a screenshot from our Zoom conversation where my colleague Ben here is doing this exercise, which maybe some of you have seen, where basically your mouse is flipped on its axis, and you have to try and attempt to draw within the lines of the outline of the star here. As you can imagine, and as you can see, it is pretty dang impossible to do. And we laughed at each other. Obviously, we're not laughing at the subject matter, but under that laughter and under that frustration is true respect for the subject matter. Again, this builds empathy towards the subject by piggybacking on that same emotional center that the laughter delivered. People are going to remember the time they laughed and the time we were all on a call and had that kind of camaraderie around this subject. Because we're trying to trace the star and kind of having fun at your own expense, they're going to remember this part of the presentation, but they might not remember that slide 2 before that just had 4 bullets on it. So again, push towards that empathy. Make sure you treat the subject with the seriousness it deserves, but it is okay to have fun with it. It's okay to kind of laugh at yourself while you learn. And making that happen is going to make people want to talk about the subject more. And I'm going to stop for 2 seconds. I know we only got 3 minutes left. I want to make sure there's no questions. All right, fantastic. Moving right along. And of course, from the account management site, I mentioned this before, account management side. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but make sure that from an account side, you have someone on your team or yourself that make sure that they have an eye on the bigger picture. Make sure that you're not just talking about your Drupal presence, but you have an eye on the marketing campaigns they're running, the public relations, just the content going into their site. When you have these check-ins with your clients, make sure you talk about it. Hey, I know we're doing this for the website, but have you thought about, putting closed captioning on this event, this webinar you have coming up? And of course, don't focus on their legal exposure, but make sure they're ready for it. You don't want them to be surprised, and you certainly don't want to scare them, but find a way to convey that information in a way that that is not intimidating to them. And I do that generally by taking a quick 30 minutes before meeting with any client, reading up on the massive court cases in their area about accessibility and how people are getting how people are faring in the court system, and I basically just use that as a quick basis of conversation. In America, generally that's done on a state-by-state basis, so obviously it might be a little different for those out in Europe. And of course, from the design side, I mentioned this earlier, but you don't want to forget that design is an important part of the website. And again, this kind of goes in the idea that you don't want to forget the rest of your users. So let designers kind of run free and emphasize the idea that it's not a constraint. It is something that they can use as another tool in their toolbox to make beautiful designs. Now, I wanted to show you this really quick case study. And I love these 2 examples that my teams have done in the past, because it kind of shows that content was never meant to be behind images, right? You see so many websites that have hero images with the text right on top of them, and they're not compliant, of course, and they're hard to read. So what we have here are 2 great examples. On the top, you have a semicircular element, and it keeps that focus on the center of the image while also keeping the focus on the title itself. And below, we just have a really quick idea of how you can separate the H1 to the view still have big, beautiful, impactful imagery. Making sure you think beyond the web, make sure your brand is rooted in that equity and you build that trust. And of course, establishing that culture. You want to make sure that, I always tell my team to work me out of the job. I am the director of accessibility, but I would love for one day there not to necessarily be that type of specialization at larger agencies or larger Drupal shops. I want everyone at the company to have that same level of understanding about accessibility. But put it in your job ads and make it as important as billing your clients. And with that, we are at time at a speedy session this morning. So thank you so much for joining me today. I genuinely love talking about this subject, as talking about it and spreading this information is for this whole subject matter is for the good of everybody. There's almost absolutely no selfish desire in this subject. Business motivations aside, those all come second, as this subject is more important than some of its parts. So thank you again. Please screenshot this. If you ever want to reach out, I'd be more than happy to send you any of those case study examples or talk to you more about documentation or strategy or anything in between. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. Please, again, I will stick around for a quick minute if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer those on chat here. And if not, reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I look forward to chatting with you soon. Thank you, everybody.